I don't know if some of those people would, and some of them even aren't even out of the woods yet, but I don't know if they would have made it past the day it happened, because the local church is a gift to sort of pull us out of that apathy and to pull us out of that pain and that sorrow, to be the hands and feet of Jesus around us. So I think the biggest challenge is apathy. The answer to that is good, solid local churches with Christians that care and love you, um, which is why I'm a really big proponent of, you know, small to medium sized churches. Just people that know you, people that actually know you.
You should write a book on that, From Apathy to Community.
Oh, there's a title. All right.
Yeah. You're not doing enough preaching, because I mean, that would have came out. Welcome back to Curious Christianity. Today we're talking about deconstruction, and I have seen lots and lots of people leaving the faith of Christianity, and they've been leaving it and posting their stories, and it has been like almost a snowball of Christians, older and younger. And today I have brought a special guest, Michael, the honest youth pastor, to talk about this subject, because I feel like it is a subject that really breaks my heart. Every time I see another friend, another person leaving the faith, it's really, really difficult. So, Michael, welcome to the channel.
Yep. Hey, Adam, thanks for having me on. Appreciate the time.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. And I've seen that you've posted a bunch of videos, some about this and some about politics and many other things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think number one, it's just encouraging to see somebody being honest and being bold about their faith and about their views without really any, I don't know, reserve that I've seen. So
Yeah, well, that reserve sometimes gets me in trouble, or that non-reservedness gets me in trouble. But yes.
yeah, it's kind of an important time to be really, really present though as a Christian, because I feel like more and more Christians, they're struggling even more so because of all of the social pressures, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And with more Christians just being proactive and making arguments or talking about their faith openly, I think it emboldens the rest of us.
Yeah,
So,
well, yeah, I think whenever you see people talking about, I think what it helps is, at least helps, I think, me early on when I saw people doing it, think through the arguments a little bit more, which was helpful. Yeah.
yeah. So, could you tell us a little bit more about your ministry and what is kind of your goal and the idea behind, the honest youth pastor? Is it to
Yeah.
combat all of the dishonest ones?
No, the name actually came from me. It it came from me just wanting to have no filter on the internet. Basically, there's a long legend of how this came to be. I won't get into it here because it's very long. But basically, the Honest Youth Pastor was just me just saying whatever I wanted to say online. That was the honest part. But the goal has changed over the years a lot of different times. Basically, now it's just to say, hey, we just need to be discerning in what we're looking at, and that covers pretty much every topic that everything in life that we're coming up against, it needs some sort of Christian discernment. So that's really the goal in this iteration of the Honest Youth Pastor, is just to be discerning on what we see. So that's why, like you said, I post videos on a lot of different things. That's why it's so varied, because basically it's like, all right, well, here's this topic. What do we do with that in light of the scriptures? So that's the goal.
I gotcha. And I believe, you've created content about deconstructionism
Mm-hmm.
and people losing their faith.
Yeah.
And so, how did that come about? Have you been seeing that in your own life or just kind of online?
Yeah, a lot of it was online, primarily, but there were people I can think of like a handful of people that I grew up with within the church that, various times, I guess at various different ages that we were at, that left the faith, some of which have come back, some of which have just deconstructed altogether out of it. And so I found it interesting because there seems to be a variety of reasons for people doing this. I mean, some people just, I know it's the trope, and I'm sorry if you can hear my dogs back here. They are,
No, you're
if you
good.
can,
You're good.
good. Okay. I'm always so paranoid about that. So, but I saw a lot of people leaving the faith for various reasons. Some of it was just the trope of like, oh, people just want to sin. Some of them, that was it. They were just, we grew up in church together. They kind of inherited that faith. It was never their own. And then the rules just kind of got to them and they just wanted to go do stuff. And that was sort of their out to do it. And then some for other people I knew, it was politics. That was a really big thing.
Mm.
2014, 15, 16 was really a start for them. That seems to be the whole online thing. That really was a lot of people's sort of doorway to that. And then it's really been like, I don't know, interesting and sad, I guess would be how I would describe it, to sort of see that flower out a little bit. I say interesting because I'm very data information driven. So I watching people and why they do things is really interesting to me. But then the sadness part like comes when it's like, oh, I know that person. Like that is, and so to see somebody go through that up close and personal is really the part that is sad because I mean you've seen them through their whole walk. And so it's not just like a data point or it's not just like some theoretical, it's like this real life thing that's happening in front of you. So that's sort of the interesting and sad part. But yeah, I've seen it personally, but a lot, the explosion has really been online more so than if it was just locally. It'd be like, oh yeah, like a dozen people or 20 people or so I've seen it, but online apparently it's very vocal. People are very vocal about
Would you say there's been an age demographic that it specifically hits more than others?
Oh yeah, I'd say probably if I had to narrow it down just by who I know on the internet and the people I know personally, it would probably be anywhere between mid mid 30s to about mid 40s. I'd say that'd be about that's everybody that's really deconstructed is about in that age range. Any mid 30s, mid 40s. You have some people that I know that are like sort of older, 50s, 60s that have that's very rare. A lot of those people a drastic like a huge drastic thing has happened in their life. A lot of the mid 30s, mid 40s are, I mean, I'm 40, so I'm right in the middle of there. But a lot of that came from, I think, some of how we grew up. And so you can see some of that playing a part in their reasoning for leaving. At least the direct conversations I've had, that's come up a number of times. So,
See, that is the part that I see as well. It's been very fascinating because I'm in that demographic, right? I'm right in that
mhm,
range, and that is exactly where I'm seeing, right? And the other reason I find that to be really interesting is that I felt like growing up, it was the teenagers, right? That
mm,
was kind of what I was looking at. Was we were looking at that old story of the kid who goes to college and loses their faith in the first couple of years,
mhm,
but now we're seeing much older, right in the
yeah,
30s, yeah, right in that range. And I've just thought that was been fascinating as to like what changed. There's
yeah.
been a huge shift in people deconverting out of that range. And I don't know if you've seen like, well, maybe you probably have what is it, Myth Vision podcast?
Oh no, I'm not aware of that one.
Okay. He's pretty much like that's his story, right? He deconverted and now that's his whole channel, right?
Okay.
Is pretty much, I mean, on I don't know, it's almost like an evangelical deconversion type of
Yeah.
channel, right?
Mhm,
And that's what he brings on other people that deconvert and talks about, oh, well, yeah, there's all these biblical myth stuff. And
mhm.
anyway, and so it's been really interesting. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of that, and again, I don't, like I said, I don't know anything about that channel so much, but I would imagine it's probably a lot of similar themes of the people that I've talked to online or that I know. Like we grew up in youth group and we went to church camp together and that sort of thing, which is that none of us were really taught a whole lot of theology outside of like very basic, very, very basic things. And so that when you grow up, so I went to college at Indiana Wesleyan University in Indiana. And when I got to college, even I remember Theology 1, there were all these terms that were being thrown out that I had never heard before in my entire life. And I thought, well, this is crazy. And then they started kind of going through a lot of little apologetics. And I was just like, this is, if it wasn't for the guardrails of having people there that you could ask questions to and really dive in, if I would have just found out about that in the wild, I don't know what would have happened because that seems to be a lot of, I mean, the friends that I grew up with, that seems to be the same sort of story is that you find out about like, the Gnostic Gospels, or you find out about like canonization, or you find, and it be when there's no, you just get a waterfall of information. It's too much for a lot of people. They're just like, well, how do I have, I mean, how do I decipher any of this? And unless you're really guided through that in a way that's, I think, helpful, and really discipled well, that should have happened way back when I was in like growing up, you can end up in some, in some just off the wall places, in my opinion, because you're trying to do this as much as you can on your own, or unfortunately being guided by some voices that are just not helpful. So,
See, this all resonates with me so much because it was so similar to, yeah, my own story where I totally have wondered and thought about like a slight turn here or there. And
mhm,
I would have been one of the atheists you see online, you know,
mhm,
I would have been, that same angry atheist making all of the angry arguments.
mhm,
But, I had those backgrounds where, so for example, my grandfather, so because I went through that period where I decided like, okay, I hit like 19, left the house, and I wanted to go live with my grandparents, and so I was away from my parents, and I
mhm,
kind of had like, okay, is this going to be the faith of my parents, or is it going to be my faith?
mhm,
And I spent hours and hours researching and studying. And when I did, my grandfather was very, very open handed. He really just said, "Hey, look, here's the evidence for this. Here's the evidence for this." And I was so also blessed that he was very knowledgeable.
mhm,
And that's where a huge aspect of my faith was really, really shaped, was that I didn't have that kind of glass faith. This is what I'm seeing, is that a lot of these other ones, they kind of grew up with this glass faith. And then
mhm.
eventually, yeah, they run into all this information and somebody cracks that glass, and it just is the gateway to everyone falling apart. That sounds similar to yours, what you're seeing?
Yeah, yeah, I would say that a lot of it. I like how you use the term open hand there. I think just the ability to say you can ask the questions, but here are the things that I am aware of and I know, and this is my answer to that. And so I think part of it is some of the people that I've talked to. I grew up in a very well, half of it was very fundamentalist in regards to like really like Southern Baptist sort of things. So things like, for example, we were at a VBS one time and we weren't allowed to draw the peace symbol on our little craft we were making because that was like, there was the devil or something. I don't remember. I just remember like they were very strict on what you could and could not do and all of that sort of thing. As there was no questioning anything. And a lot of the people that I know growing up had that similar thing, or the people I've talked to online have that, where it's very like no room for question at all. Here it is. And there's definitely a place for that, in the sense that I think it's sort of, I mean, again, I'm just gleaning off what you said here, sort of maybe what your grandfather did for you, which was like, you can ask the questions, but here are the answers. Now you can do whatever you want with those answers, but here are the answers. And that's a lot of the way that, for better or worse, I guess we'll find out, that I do a lot of the discipleship that I do, and just even raising my kids, is that like, you have to own it. This isn't something I can just give you. This isn't something you can just copy and paste. If you have the questions, use your brain. Like I tell my daughter that. I mean, my daughter's the older of the two kids right now, and I tell her that all the time. I'm like, you have a brain. God gave you a brain. Use the brain. You can't like my whole thing with her, because I've seen so many people grow up in church and leave, is that like if you one day decide you want to leave the church, that's on you, but it is not at any fault of anybody else that's tried to give you like all, I mean, had open hands information, you were able to ask questions, like there's not been any blockade here. And so I always encourage just the use of your brain. Just ask the questions and then actually address the answers. Like just because somebody says it over here doesn't mean it's right and it doesn't mean it's wrong, but actually ask the question and look at what has been said. And I'm confident enough, especially now, just going through church history, reading a lot of the early church fathers, seeing how Christianity has developed. Like there's no question that you're going to ask that somebody has not already set for some sort of answer for it that you can access. And so I think a lot of it, like you said, it is that sort of an unawareness of the faith that you've been handed. And so when somebody does come along and go, yeah, what about this? You don't know that that's already been addressed a long time ago, a lot of times. And so it's just because you don't have those resources and somebody sounds like they've outsmarted you, And then typically gives you a road right to their way of thinking. It does happen to where, unfortunately, I've seen it a number of times. Um, the slippery slope into progressive Christianity or just agnosticism is really fast after that, because you weren't given anything really to build your faith on. You couldn't explain any doctrines. You were just told this, and then there you go. So
Yeah, and that's definitely been my experience. And so like with some of the people that have, well, they've been trying to deconvert me, they've deconverted. Now they're come
uh-huh.
about asking all these questions like, oh, what about this verse? What about this?
Mhm.
How do these, isn't this a contradiction? And I've been very disappointed in the sense that like these are not really that strong. Like these are not, there's not a good argument. And I look it up and show like, okay, look, this is why it's resolved. Like this is not a problem.
Mhm.
And they're not actually doing their homework. And that's why like it's one of those things like after they get through the tipping point, they're no longer in that section where they're asking honest questions. They're just really trying to
Mhm.
trip you up and everything's different from that point forward. And it's really rough once they kind of cross over and kind
Mhm.
of break the barrier.
Yeah. That's my biggest contention with some of my friends that I grew up with, some of what people I used to be close with, is that it's no longer, well, here's the answer to that question, that was the church has already addressed. Now it's, well, in an effort not to adopt a theology, they've adopted a theology anyway. And so now that theology, I just find it very interesting that progressive Christianity, by and large, is just a different river of fundamentalism. It is just as fundamentalist as the fundamentalists we came from. It's just a different set of fundamentals now. And so just as there's friends that I have that will just gripe on the church for not allowing any sort of questions to be asked, but their new system doesn't allow that either. And so I think one of those things is that one of the richest resources we have that, unfortunately, sometimes, like you said, after people get over a tipping point, they just won't use anymore, is um and people hate this because it sounds too Catholic, but really the early church is just full of resources that give us like a really good timeline of how doctrines were worked out, the arguments for those doctrines, um, that we weren't taught necessarily, some of us growing up, and people leave the faith, but now they won't hear those arguments now. And so, yeah, I think after that tipping point, it's just weird that in an effort to not be religious, one becomes even more religious than they were before. It's just a different religion.
Funny how that works out, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, see, in reality, I actually don't necessarily think it's that funny because in many ways, the problem is they never actually grew up, right? They never
Mm.
actually developed a more robust way of thinking. Uh, Kind of like I said, they kind of created this glass ceiling of beliefs and they just replaced it with a new one instead of becoming a stronger, more kind of composite type of belief system, right? So that's one thing I think is really important. And I've taught a little bit more in like apologetics classes. And I learned this actually from a philosophy professor at a community college. And one of the things he did, right, was he would show us these arguments, and by the end of class, everyone's just like convinced, oh my gosh, like that's just like the best thing ever. It's totally true. And then in the last like 5-10 minutes, he would just destroy it. And this is actually what I think that all Christians need to do in instructing their youth today is that you need to show them a Christian argument that sounds going to sound like it works, and then you need to destroy it in front of them. Because the
Mm,
point is, if that one argument is false, it does not make Christianity false.
mm,
It should not destroy your faith. And that's where, because at some point, you or any other pastor has taught you something wrong.
yeah.
Nobody's omniscient. They've taught you something wrong. And just because that one little belief was incorrect, they misunderstood it, they
Yeah.
fill in the blank, does not mean that the rest of our faith was wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think that goes back. I really like your analogy of, instead of letting the grass break, it becomes stronger by become more composite. Because I think I've seen that happen not only in my life, but in the lives of other, people around me, that like whenever that's questioned, and that's what And again, it's not to, it's probably more my fault than anybody else's fault, but that's really the goal of the page, is to push a little bit on people's belief system and be like, all right, so you believe this. Why do you believe that though? And that's usually if somebody, that's how I operate with my kids. It's how I operate with the people I disciple. It's how I try to operate online, is that you can't just go, that's wrong. Okay, well, tell me why it's wrong then. Tell me why you believe it is wrong. And I think that's one of the things what you're saying there is, we have these ideas of what we believe, but sometimes when they're pushed on, we have no real reason that we can back it up with. So that's a great, I think it's a great great exercise I might copy and paste somewhere, is that you don't really know what you believe until it's completely tested, which is why I think really, I call it sparring, but it's one of those things
Mhm.
where as believers, I mean, to go out one another, not with the intent of taking you down or like belittling you, but like just pushing. Like, why do I really hold this position? And doing that with other believers that will be open and honest. Like, well, there's a hole there, there's a hole there, so that whenever you do have to have that conversation with somebody, you're more prepared than being caught off guard, like you're talking about there, right? Somebody just completely destroying your argument that you thought you had because you've never even tested it before. I really like that glass analogy. That's a good analogy.
Yeah. It's really important. And, I had a youth, he was, I think at the time he was like 17, 18, and he was one of the really, really bright ones, really well trained in apologetics. I mean, like he was on top of it. He was also on the debate team. I actually watched some of his actual debates as well at his school. He's a very strong debater, even compared to many, many adults. But I do remember sparring with him one time, and he took the moral argument and I took, the opposite. I took like moral subjectivism. Okay. And to me, that's a really hard case to argue for, but I beat him down. I argued and was beating him down on moral subjectivism, which again, like, couldn't technically work because of course I think a moral realism is true. But the point was simply that I had better arguments and rhetoric and he was not able to kind of punch through.
Hmm.
And I hope it, was a little bit more of an eye opener because again, this is one of the students who was really well trained. Like he
Hmm.
was not a slouch. He was a
Yeah.
good arguer. And it's one of those things where you really have to look into like, look, even if you're smart and intelligent, there is somebody out there who's really, really smart and
Oh
intelligent.
yeah.
You know, not everybody is going to lay down and die. So I have another important question here that I'm curious what you think. Do
Hmm.
you think which one is more important, Christian apologetics today or Christian influencers
Which one's more important? I would say
today?
apologetics. Now, which one has more influence? I think we both know the answer there. But apologetics, I think, is more. I think what we're missing, if we're talking about apologetics, is really apologetics in regards to sort of what we see in the first century, like the Tertullian, like just saying, "Hey, you guys have this concept of what Christianity is. This is what it really is." I see a lot of apologetics now that's good. I don't think it's bad. I think it's good to have like the debating sort of apologetics. But I think something that we may be missing is just, and I think this plays into the deconstruction part a little bit, is because a lot of the people, myself included, growing up would say we knew what the, like why we believed what we believed, but when you actually were like, you couldn't communicate that. And a lot of the most early apologetics is just a no, this is like, you think we do this, this is why we really do it. And it wasn't really a debate as much, it was just like, you just got it wrong, like this is just really what we believe. And I think if we could get part of that, I know this is sort of off in the weeds to your question here, but I think if we could get part of that back, that would be super helpful. Just catechizing, just basic, hey, you say you're a Christian, do you know what that means? The youth pastor actually at the church I attend, because even though it's Honest Youth Pastor is my name, I'm more of like an associate pastor than I am anything else. And the youth pastor at the church that I attend, he's been really working with that. Joe is his name. He's a great guy, one of my best friends. And one of the things that he's tried to do with the kids is say, you say you're a Christian, explain to me what that means then. And then he kind of dialogues back and forth with them so that they have sort of that apologetic for that. And I'll stop rambling now.
What role do you think personal experience plays in all of this? Because to me, that's the other part. Like when we look at deconversion,
Hmm.
right? That seems to me to be a very big portion of or part of what's going on as well. Is that there is this aspect of personal experience where they're feeling very disconnected from the church
Hmm.
because there's all these different things that are going on in their life. But the one thing that doesn't seem to be going on, there doesn't seem to be this connection with God in the same way. Like, what do you think about that?
I think one of the things that I think culturally has happened is that we have sort of the order off. What I mean by that is that Christianity or our faith is sort of one of many things that we do versus the thing that we see everything through. And so
Mm.
if we understand that as a believer, everything that happens in my life is meant to be seen through the lens of scripture and the gospel. Personal experience plays a bit of a lesser role, or at least it's contextualized better. If I understand as a believer that I am to live for the glory of God and obey his commands, um, then my personal experience is filtered through that. So like bad experiences are not like terrible earth-shattering things. It's God sanctifying me through a sinful world to make me more like Christ. Versus if I'm a Christian, if I'm living this life and Christianity is one of the things, it's sort of like, well, why did God allow this to happen? Like, how does Christianity even connect to it? Like, there is a distance because it's not my identity. It's just one of the things that I do. And I think one of the things that the culture doesn't necessarily help is it wants us to prioritize Christianity as one of the things. Like you're fine to be a Christian over here, but you're not supposed to see the culture through that. And so that personal, I think, experience, if not categorized and seen correctly, can lead to like this deconstruction thing, right? So if my identity, and a lot of the deconstructionists I know, for example, started in 2016, like I said, and a lot of that came from politics. And so, whenever they see their Christianity connected to conservatism or politics, and that whole thing sort of blows up, then their identity blows up and personal experience blows up. And now it's not I'm a Christian viewing the world through this. It's I'm a Christian. It's this and the other thing. And so, hopefully, that answer makes sense. I think it plays a huge part, but the part it plays varies on if it's ordered rightly versus if it's out of order. Because if it's out of order, it's gonna be like, why is why is this happening? What yada? I mean, it's gonna just completely be seen incorrectly, and then I'm gonna draw incorrect assumptions or conclusions from all the things happening in my life.
As a Christian, how are we supposed to manage or handle our connection to politics, though? Because I
Mhm.
know that you do talk about politics to
Yeah,
some degree, and this is a very, very sticky issue. And I know a lot of pastors that do not want to touch it at all. And you just talked about the idea that, okay, we should have our Christianity and see the world through a particular lens. But some people are connecting their politics to their
hmm
Christianity in a way. So, how do we manage this in a healthy way?
yeah. Well, I think everything we again should see through as believers through the lens of the gospel, meaning that's why Christians are supposed to live in a certain way within a marriage, within how I lead my kids and how I interact with the political sphere. And so at the end of the day, I don't think it can be separated. It's just we have a tendency to try to prioritize it over other things. And so today I've had a whole bunch of discussions because it's something I posted on Instagram today with people about how the fundamental differences they may have with specifically their spouse on issues of politics, but just in general, the church on politics. I don't think it's a super difficult conversation because at the end of the day, we live in this tension of knowing that we're in this world and God is using us in this world, but this isn't our home, nor is it our the final spot. And so our philosophy on politics is driven. It has to be driven because everything else we do as believers is driven by the reality of the gospel. And so we see the world through that. And I think that makes us uncomfortable sometimes because that doesn't necessarily put us in a particular party. Now, obviously, I think it could be very well argued that there's a leaning toward probably historically the Republican Party more often than not, though that could still be contended now. But we see where we're sort of caught in the middle here, where our allegiance is to Christ. And so there's certain things that we just can't sign off on either side. So we are left. It's super easy. I was having this conversation with somebody the other day that's having some, well, is trying to disciple a couple through this incredibly difficult marriage situation. And the conversation we're having is the easy lever to pull is the divorce lever, because it just takes my hands off of it. I don't have to put any of the work into it. It's done. And it's very similar, I think, with politics. It's really easy to pull the lever and say, I'm over on this team, because then I'm just done. I'm in this team. I'm on this, I'm with you guys. I'm not fighting you. I'm with you. And I think really as Christians, though, there is this tension that we have to say, no, we gotta work through the mess of it, though, to where, and not be ashamed of that. But a lot of times when you do that, um, you're gonna get flack from people because you're not on the team. And what you're saying is, as a Christian, like, hey, I like this. Christ commands me to do this, so I'm walking in this tension. When it's a whole lot easier just to pull the lever and say, no, I'm over here with you guys, and not, what do they call it? Punching left or right, right? It's like you're allowed to punch one side, but you can't punch the other way. And I think, in a very long way, hopefully answering your question, I think it's a tense place for Christians to walk in, because we do need to address it, because we live in a world in which our beliefs are going to be in some way connected with legislation. And so we have to walk in a way that says, how can I best honor God in this place I've been put, while obviously, leaning a direction, but still saying to those that are this direction, yeah, but you got this thing wrong. So I think it's a really tense spot. If the short answer is, it's a tense place to live as a believer, because you can't be sold in either way.
It does make it very difficult, and life can be very difficult in that arena.
Mhm.
So, for the rest of the world, and as you see young people and all of these things, what is the most challenging issue that young Christians face today? And when I think of young Christians now, I do think a little bit more in the category of somewhere between like 20 and 40. I mean, no longer think about those same teenagers I used to, because I almost feel like so many of them, they've almost been stunted in their growth, and they never really leave that college age
Mhm.
range. They kind of stay there now till 30 and 40. So how can we kind of make these adjustments?
Well, I think you asking what the challenge is. I think the challenge, to maybe make it a little general here and cast a really broad net, is just the challenge not to become apathetic. I mean, there's a lot of people, like, again, that will grow up, get married, have kids, and have a job. And it's really easy in all of that that's going to naturally produce anxiety, stress, just exhaustion of life. It's really easy to just be like, it's just like, whatever. Like, I guess I believe this, but like, if you pushed me, I wouldn't really know. And if something does like explode over here, maybe I am out. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of people I talk to that are my age, and probably, I mean, around our ages, that are, depending on the day you talk to them, hanging on by a thread, because there's so much happening in their life. And this makes it 10 times more difficult if they don't have a good local church. Um, and what I found by just talking about it a lot is that I guess a lot of people don't have really good local church. So I think the issue is apathy. The solution is good local churches. Is that, it's really easy just to give up and just go with the flow, because some autopilot's a whole lot easier than turning off my television show and actually digging into something that will edify me. And at least if I'm watching the TV, the kids leave me alone. But if I'm trying to read, they seem like they're here all the time. And so it's just easier just to go with it. But I think if you have just, if you, I call it redeeming your day. If you find the times in your day that you say, I have this 15 minutes that I know no one's going to bug me. Mine's my commute. No one's going to bug me. And so I can use this time to redeem that part of it. To listen to the scriptures, to listen to like a theology, a book, and then be connected to a really good local church. Because here's the thing, and I mean, maybe you know this. Hopefully, some listeners know this. Whenever terrible things happen in your life, those are make or break times for a lot of people. It's deconstruction, it's go deeper in, it's give up, it's lean into God. Like it's one or the other. And especially in my local church context recently, I mean, we've had people that have had cancer. We had a mother and father that lost their 20-year-old son to a car accident. We've had some terrible marital issues. We've had a couple people with cancer. There's just been a lot that's happened. And without a really strong local church, I don't know if some of those people would, and some of them even aren't even out of the woods yet, but I don't know if they would have made it past the day it happened, because the local church is a gift to sort of pull us out of that apathy and to pull us out of that pain and that sorrow to be the hands and feet of Jesus around us. So I think the biggest challenge is apathy. The answer to that is good, solid local churches with Christians that care and love you, which is why I'm a really big proponent of, you know, small to medium sized churches. Just people that know you, people that actually know you.
You should write a book on that, From Apathy to Community.
Oh, there's a title. All right.
Yeah. You're not doing enough preaching, because I mean, that would have came out naturally if you were.
That would have. Yeah.
I mean, but that sounds like, yeah, just a really, really, yeah, good title. And I mean, honestly, I could say that played a huge role in, my own
Mhm.
life as well, was that I had a lot of good Christian friends who, when
Mhm.
I had problems, when I had questions, they were there, and, they were there to rescue me out of some of my own mind traps, right? When I was, struggling with the apologetics questions, like, oh, but what about this one and this one? And
Mhm.
my buddy's like, no, but this is how this works out. This works out fine, and all of those things. And then, yeah, the other emotional struggles and trials that we go through just cannot be ignored. It's such a huge part of
Yeah.
life. And I do think it's a problem for some people that are in the much more intellectual churches, where it's just all head knowledge. And
Mhm.
then, yeah, mom gets hit by a car, dad dies by cancer. And it's like, everything you knew up here is not translating as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where, I mean, when Paul talks about like the hands and feet and like how there is a gift. I'm blanking. I just recently preached on it not too long ago, but where he's talking about each of you has been given a spiritual gift by the Spirit, and you're supposed to use that for the benefit of those in the body. And I think that's where, and again, another thing I appreciate about my church is that what I find is funny is I am much more didactical and heady, and my pastor is much more empathetic towards situation. I'm just not naturally an empathetic person, but he is, and I think what's really that has balanced me out a whole lot more. We talked about that the other day. Just the fact that we are so drastically different is incredibly helpful. And just to touch on another point, not to talk your ear off, but to touch on that point about the people you have around you is incredibly important. You're talking about the people that I know that have deconstructed, the people they had around, the people that they allowed around them directly influence the path they took. And some of them deliberately shut out Christian voices for various reasons. But the people they had around them, I mean, I can look, 4, 5, 6 years down the road since it happened. I mean, there's no doubt that the people they had around them laid the foundation to where they are now. And for me, I'm not going to give this story, but like I said, the account short story is this account started from us having a pretty bad transition out of a church, and
Mhm.
I had already as a young kid, probably 9, 10, a church had split, so I had seen that before, but I really didn't feel like the ramifications of it that young. And when this happened, I was just like, if Christians are like this, forget them. Like I don't. If this is how you treat people, I don't. I mean, I get treated better by pagans than I get treated by you. And if it hadn't been for somebody inviting me to the church we're at now, that could have went a whole different way. But I had somebody again that was just really caring, knew knew what that hardship felt like, had been through it themselves, and said, "Hey, I think if you came over here, that'd be good for you." And I sat there. Me and my family sat there for a year, just sitting there. We didn't do nothing. We just showed up on Sunday. That's all we did. And my pastor was incredibly, again, empathetic, and just let that healing happen as it needed to happen. But it happened because, again, the people we go to church with are, they love you, they care about you, they're willing for you to take your own time. Um, and they're going to be with you every step of the way. And I think that is 100% the reason I am where I am now, is because of those people that got put around me. And they weren't heady theological people; they were caring people, and it was just a good balance, um, to bring me personally where I needed to be. So,
I think that's so important. And I mean, I've been through church hurt, and that's one of the other things I see from a lot of people is
mm,
like church hurt. It's really tough,
yeah,
right? And I've had those moments as well where it's like, okay, I've got something bad going on, and yeah, sometimes the Christians are not the ones there for me.
yeah,
And I fortunately, I will say I have had Christian brothers that have been there for me, that have supplied my needs, that have taken care of me. But there's one moment in particular. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning, and my car breaks down. Okay, like I'm driving home. I was supposed, long trip or something, driving home. 1 o'clock in the morning, car breaks down. Okay, and I'm in a part of town that is not so good. Okay, never mind, not so good. It is a bad part of town. Like it is proactively dangerous.
hmm,
Like this is where the drugs, the guns, all of those things are.
yeah,
And I've only my phone isn't going to last for forever, and so I've got a little bit limited amount of time, I think, as well, maybe to call somebody. And so I remember this moment because I remember that there was a pastor that lived somewhat close, relatively close. And I had another friend who at the time was not a Christian or anything like that. I was thinking about, who do I call? And I distinctly remember thinking, I'm not really confident that my Christian friend will pick up the phone, like that my pastor will answer the phone. And so I called my atheist friend, and he picked up, and he came and drove out at 1 in the morning, roaming the streets to come and find me and get me and let me stay at his house, and it was a great experience.
hmm,
But I just remember exactly that moment. It's a crucial moment. And I'm sure for some other people, like those could have been like really, really deciding moments, because
hmm,
I just know that in many scenarios I've had, yeah, some of my secular friends, they were the ones there for me. They were the ones there to pick me up, take care of me, make sure that I was,
hmm,
safe and secure. And I just wasn't confident about that, and I think it makes a huge difference when you can
yeah,
be 100% confident that, oh yeah, your Christian brothers and sisters are going to be there for you. And I think it's
hmm,
really, really missing sometimes for the other end.
yeah. Well, and a lot of that, I think, I mean, again, there's a whole discussion I think we can have on church hurt, but I think just on the topic you're having there of just people knowing that they can count on you is incredibly. We have there's a guy that goes to our church named Nate, and his mom goes to our church. She has cancer, and her son takes care of her currently. And the other day we had a men's meeting, and we always have food left over, and so he just ran it over to her house. Um, he goes over there quite a bit, so he knew where the key was. Took it in, put it in the fridge, just put a note on it, and left because she was sleeping. And I happened to work with her son at actually just my job that I have, and I was working one day. We were getting kind of finished up, and he came by and he mentioned, he's like, "Hey, Nate came by the other day, and left that. And if you see him, tell him how much I appreciated that." And I think it just speaks to the reality that, like, if it's the cliche, people need to know how much you care before they care thing. But like, I think a lot of it is that if we as believers could be, I think we've shifted again, talking about apologetics. We're very much like, I want to win the argument. I think there's a nice balance of being able to say, like, I know what I'm talking about, but I also want to 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 provide for you if I can. And that's, I think, where that the whole body comes into play. Nate is never going to have a deep theological argument with anybody, but he is going to be there to provide food for somebody that needs to. And I think that's where the body comes into play, right? There's going to be people that were like, "Hey, that guy is great at that, and this guy not so great." But all of us need to recognize where our weaknesses are and really ask the Spirit to strengthen us in that area. Like I said, there's been a lot of prayers that Lord, make me more empathetic. I don't know what that looks like, but make me more empathetic, um, so that I can be a better witness for you. Because I mean, that made a huge impact. Nate dropping that food off dude talked about that a couple weeks later. Like it meant a huge deal to him. And so I think that's incredibly important part of it.
See, I
So,
love my church. We have a saying and we call it sharing the love of Jesus in a practical way.
mm,
And that is exactly, what we look to do sometimes on things like that, where we're looking to share the love of Jesus by helping somebody, cutting their grass, feeding
mhm,
them or supplying their needs. And that is honestly, it's right there in the gospel. In the gospels, Jesus is talking about like,
mhm,
hey, well, you were the one who came and gave me clothes when I was naked. You were the one who fed me when I was
mhm,
hungry. You're like, Lord, when did we feed you? When did I see you and you were naked?
mhm.
And he's like, yeah, for the ones that you did just like this, you did it to me.
Yeah.
And that can be lost on some people. And I get it. That I think it's important for each one of us to play into our gifts. Like if you're more intellectually oriented, that's great. Focus that direction. Because I actually also felt like there was kind of a bit of a negative backlash to some degree when we kind of had this gospel movement where it was just like, if you're not an evangelist, you're hardly a Christian, right? If you're not out there making disciples every single day.
Yeah.
But I really wrestled with that a little bit and thought about that seriously and just asking like, okay, Lord, what is really wanted from you? And that for those that are called to be theologians, I thought about, for example, William Lane Craig. You know what? If William Lane Craig was out there sharing the gospel instead of studying, he wouldn't be the person he is today.
Mhm,
And you know what? He's supposed to be behind the book studying. He's not supposed to be in the streets. He's supposed to be reading,
mhm,
and for some people, that's your job. You should just be at the library. You should just be behind your books or behind your computer, studying, writing, and
mhm.
doing those sorts of things. And for other people, it's the opposite. They're just supposed to be in hospice care. They're supposed to be at the old person's home. They're not supposed to be at home studying with you. They're supposed to be doing what God has called them to be. Each one of us
Yeah.
are a different part of the body, and we shouldn't, complain to the foot, hey, why aren't you doing eyeball things?
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I'm
Mhm.
walking here. I'm walking here.
It was a good tie-in with the I'm walking here. I like that. No,
So
I
what oh, good, good.
oh, I was just gonna say, I think that's incredibly important to know. That point I think is missed a lot. One of the things, honestly, that we've been trying to do recently, just within my local church, is really hit that home a little bit. Is that like I don't you have been given a very specific spiritual gift from the Holy Spirit. Find out what that is, because I think the beauty of it is that there are people that we have that really physically can't do anything, as far as practically mow a lawn or help clean the church or help fix something. But we have a couple ladies that their whole thing is that like they can send out prayer requests to everybody via text. They can do that. And I think sometimes we even automate that. Like there's systems that, I get ads all the time. Hey, you text your whole child. I'm like, no, it takes away Emily's job if I do that. I don't want to do that. Just let Emily do it. That's what she can do for the body. And I think when we realize that, you have when people know that God has given them a gift for the local body and they need to utilize it, there's such a beautiful balance there, to where sometimes the heady people need to be like, shut up, just help. And sometimes the people that are just trying to be like, yeah, there's a deeper theological thing here we need to talk about. I think that is where the family of God, rightly ordered, rightly working, doesn't become silos of like, oh, well, this is the intelligent church, or this is the, the loving church, or this church over here is the giving church. It's like, well, I think if we all combined, it'd be a whole lot better, because all of these gifts, when working together rightly, actually is what the church looks like. So there was a rant on that, but yeah, I think if we know that that is something we're supposed to do, and we're not supposed to look like the other guy, sometimes is helpful.
I've often wished that we could have this coordination where people, church members, could learn to go from one church to the next, like where you just have a pastor that's the great teacher, and then you got the evangelist church, right, which
Hmm.
is preaching Jesus like every Sunday. And so like they could go in there, get saved, and then like stay there for a little while, and then like migrate to the teaching church for their catechizing.
Yeah.
They can learn all their good theology, and then I mean, I know some people will hate me for this, but then maybe migrate over to the charismatic church. And I don't want to say that like churches should literally be so divided,
Hmm.
right? But then you have the hospital church where it's like, okay, now
Yeah.
after you got church stuff, like you got to migrate back over to the hospital church where you're just going to be loved and you're just going to be cared on, and everybody's just going to be there to be like, man, how are you doing today? Like, what's going on? How's your family? What's your wife doing? How are your kids? And so you just have that beautiful thing, because one of the things that I find to be really unfortunate is that pastors cannot do it all.
Oh,
like
no.
As a pastor, you are gifted with a certain set of gifts. And it's tough when some people in the congregation are coming to you complaining because you don't have the gifts that they do. Maybe, it's like, you're not loving enough. You're not caring enough. Oh, you can't answer my questions. And they want you to have all of the gifts. That's their expectation. Well, you're the pastor. Of course you have the answer, right? Fix my marriage, like everything under the sun. And I just feel like as I've grown up, I've realized more and more, it's just unrealistic. Like you shouldn't even just expect that from your pastor. Like, yeah, sure, he's there to help shepherd you, but he cannot save you from everything. And he just isn't going to have all the answers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at that point, you're just like, just go read Acts. Guys, the apostles were literally like, we're not doing this. Assign deacons for this. We're not doing it. I think, again, if you try to put everything, and that's one of the things, my particular denomination is a Wesleyan denomination. I think I might have mentioned that, but one of a few things we disagree with. All right, we have issues with one another, but one of them is that a lot of churches are like sole pastors. And so what happens, I mean, our church luckily has like 4 retired pastors just attending anyway. And so they share the load a lot. And so that's super helpful. But most churches that I know that are Wesleyan churches have like one pastor. He's got to do it all. And I mean, there's churches I've went to where I've guest preached at, where I'll go and there's like one guy does the announcements, he does the offering, he does the singing, and then I get up and I'm like, none of these people can do any of the things you just did. And yeah, it gets stressful, which is why, I mean, I know this episode isn't about burnout, but this is why I think some ministers get burnout, because they're taking on the load of literally the whole body, and that's not the job. So,
but you know what? You have pastors now as well who are deconstructing because of burnout, because of some of those other things. Like one of the guys actually that I know, that was, his thing. He used to be an SBC pastor, Southern Baptist Church pastor, but now he's gone. He's completely out of the faith, completely in opposition and skeptical of everything. And, actually I know somebody else as well. Like, like they're in ministry. They're completely in there. But yeah, some of these other things came up and hit them. And they were just like, this just does not align with my reality. And I actually also think burnout is a really, really rough thing. And I think that Christians make it worse, unfortunately. So for example, once you get into ministry, for most Christian circles, it is considered you cannot leave. If you leave, right, you're doing something wrong. You failed the call. You've missed the mission. I just don't see anything in the Bible about that. I don't see any reason to think that's true. And I think that if some pastors had that ability to go, hey guys, I got to step out. I'm smoked. I'm not going to be of service in a healthy and helpful way. And I just need to go back to the workforce for some time. If not, maybe the rest, who knows? God calls us for certain times to certain places. And I think it's really, really unfortunate that some pastors feel trapped and they don't have the option to leave.
Yeah. My friend Rob, his church, he pastors out in North Dakota. They have he's the lead teaching pastor, but they have elders. I think they have 4 additional elders aside of him, and they are in there for 2 years. That's the idea. Is there's a rotation out for that purpose. Is that like after 2 years? I don't know if it's like a mandatory. After 2 years, you definitely got to go out, or if you can choose that. He's told me before I forget, but the reason behind it is that like, look, like this is going to wear you out. There's going to be things so they're constantly bringing potential elders up to train underneath, so that whenever, this rotation comes out, this other guy can come in. And then Rob, he's a little stubborn, but luckily his elders have come alongside and said, like, you have too much of a workload. And so like he had to itemize a list for them and be like, these are all the things I do. And he had to really have a lot of faith in them. in handing that over to them and telling them, like, what do you think needs to be cut here, and what load do you think, needs to be offset on somebody else, so that that burnout doesn't happen. On top of that, he's got I think it's Fridays, I believe, where he'll go, like, Fridays, everybody knows you do not contact Rob. Here's the contact number for somebody else, but Rob has no phone today. You're not going to get a hold of him. He's out fishing, he's out hunting, he's out with his family. He's doing something, but he's not here at all. And so they purposely built that in so that he had that time to breathe. They built it in for the other elders so that there is this rotation in and out, so that, like, there's no shame in you stepping, like, you're gonna, if you come back in a year, great. If not, you're good. I mean, you've served the church well. Um, and there's really a system, which is probably one of the, I'm sure it's not like they didn't, you know, pioneer this, but it's one of the healthier systems I've seen that really does give them leeway to take time so that they don't get burnt out. Another thing, and I don't think he'd care that I'm sharing this, because I think he shared it on our podcast, but there's things that he knows that he wouldn't be able to do ministry wise. So, for example, like counseling PTS. Why is that slipping my post traumatic stress syndrome? Like, those guys have gone through that, because Rob, he was in the military and he's dealt with that himself, and so they decided early on, like, certain counseling cases, this guy's going to handle. I say all of that to say this: they've built in a system so that that doesn't happen, or to at least a contingency plan, so that, like, as pastors, as leaders, as elders, there's going to be as healthy as a system that we can have here, so that there's not burnout. And if you guys have questions, like, they talk amongst themselves all the time about, like, what are you struggling with? Like, what are the questions you have? And it's one of the healthiest systems I've ever heard of. Because you are right. There's a lot of pastors. I've seen them on TikTok. I don't know any. I know some pastors that I went to college with that have, like, went more liberal. I don't know if I'd say deconstructed, but there are a lot of pastors I see online that have deconstructed, which that's a whole other topic we could talk about for an hour. It blows my mind that, like, how did you get that far and get put in that position, and now you don't believe any of it. But yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely very unfortunate.
Hmm.
Very unfortunate. So here's one of the last questions that I want to ask you, because to me, it's the one that I've also seen, is that for those, and we may not even know the answer for this for most people, but it was something actually that one of my uncles brought up a long time ago. And it was a pastor that they had seen who ended up, I think he kind of got ousted out of the ministry. I can't remember if it was an affair or it was one of those things, and he ended up, leaving on completely bad terms and everything like that. And the remark by several people in the congregation was, you know what? I've never heard of or seen him pray on his own. And so the notion was that ministry was all about the public eye, but he had nothing in the private sphere. So what
Hmm.
role do you feel like having a personal devotion time plays in all of this?
Well, I don't know how you could do it without. There's just not in all of the counseling I've done with people that are doubting their faith or having questions. One of the first questions I always ask is, how is your prayer life and how is your scripture reading? Inevitably, if they've fallen into sin, or if something has happened, it's probably because those two things have stopped. And that's the same I think that's doubly true for pastors, in the regard is, for pastors, it's very tempting to read the scriptures just to prepare a message, and not just read the scriptures because you love reading the scriptures. Because there's always a sermon, there's always a Bible study, there's always something you got to get ready for. And I think for pastors specifically, for asking that question, it's invaluable. Like, there's got to be a time that I don't know how you could be a pastor and not rely fully on prayer. Because when you're in the trenches, and again, I say this as somebody that it's not, this isn't full time for me. This is, I assist at best at my church. Um, but you're on the front lines of devastation in people's lives almost constantly. And if you're not in prayer, if you're not laying all of that before the Lord all the time, if you're not going to scripture continually saying, Lord, I just like, you need just to, you need, I need shepherded by you. I don't know how you'd make it, because you do get to see, unfortunately, the worst of situations, the worst of people. Um, and if you're not fully relying on the Lord, you're not, if you don't have a solid prayer life and a solid scripture reading time, um, good luck. So, I mean, I don't know how else to say it. Good luck, because that's incredibly, um, and honestly, I don't know how long you could last if it was just for the public eye. I mean, I'm sure maybe you could last for a long time if you got enough accolades, maybe, but there's enough to get you down when you're actually working in and amongst people on a daily basis, that you, if you're not relying fully on the Lord, I don't know how you're going to do it.